Ethan Carter never imagined he'd go to war with his neighbors. His family farm, nestled on the outskirts of Willow Creek, had been in his family for over 80 years. When his grandfather passed away, he inherited the 12-acre property, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of modern life. But one morning, his tranquility shattered. The rumble of engines and slamming car doors yanked him awake at dawn. Ethan stormed outside, still in his pajamas, only to find dozens of cars parked across his east field, the very land where he planned to plant crops next week. A woman in a crisp navy blue suit stood in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, directing traffic like she owned the place. "Good morning," she chirped, her smile fake and practiced. "I'm Veronica Hughes, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. This lot has been designated for community overflow parking." Ethan's blood boiled. "This is my land. You're trespassing." Veronica tilted her head condescendingly. "Oh, you must be mistaken. Our bylaws clearly state this area is for public use." Ethan clenched his fists. His family's legacy was under attack, but Veronica had no idea. She had just picked a fight with the one man who controlled their electricity. Ethan's jaw clenched as he stared at the cars trespassing on his land. But what made his blood truly boil wasn't the vehicles. It was Veronica Hughes, the HOA president, standing there with a smug grin, acting like she owned the place. "You have 1 hour to move every single car off my land, or I'll have them all towed," Ethan warned, gripping his phone. Veronica's expression didn't falter. Instead, she tilted her head condescendingly. "Mr. Carter, you don't seem to understand. This land has been used for overflow parking for years. Your grandfather must have allowed it." Ethan scoffed. "That's a lie. My grandfather would never agree to something like this." Just then, a loud truck engine roared from the back of his property. Ethan turned. A massive pickup was reversing straight toward his tomato plants. "Stop that truck!" he shouted, sprinting across the field. The driver slammed on the brakes just inches from Ethan's carefully tended crops. "What the hell are you doing?" Ethan yelled. The driver, looking confused, gestured toward Veronica. "She told me to park the bigger vehicles in the back." Ethan turned, eyes blazing. "You're destroying my farm!" Veronica sighed dramatically. "Mr. Carter, we have an important community golf tournament today. Surely you understand that community events require parking." Ethan's fists clenched. "I don't care if it's the Super Bowl. You and your people are trespassing. Move these cars, now!" A voice interrupted. "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary." Ethan turned to see a man in an expensive suit step out of a black SUV. His sharp features and cold smile screamed lawyer. "Jeffrey Williams," the man introduced himself. "HOA legal counsel. I understand there's some confusion regarding property rights." Ethan folded his arms. "No confusion at all. This is my land, and you have no right to use it." Jeffrey's smirk widened. "Actually, an easement was established years ago allowing community access to this land. I have documents at my office." Ethan stepped closer. "Then go get them, right now." Jeffrey chuckled, as if Ethan was some misinformed child. "There's no need for threats, Mr. Carter. We can discuss this like reasonable adults." Ethan glanced at his fields, his legacy, his family's land, invaded, trampled, and disrespected. A fire burned in his chest. "You have 1 hour," Ethan repeated. "Then I'm calling the sheriff." Veronica's smug grin finally cracked. "You wouldn't dare." Ethan pulled out his phone. "Try me." Veronica's hand snapped onto his wrist. "Listen carefully, Carter. This community includes the mayor, the police chief, and city council members. Who do you think the sheriff is going to side with? Ethan yanked his arm away. I guess we'll find out. But as he stormed back toward his house, an idea struck him, one that made his pulse race. Because what Veronica and her corrupt HOA didn't know was that Ethan controlled their power supply. Ethan stormed into his house, heart pounding. He needed proof, real, undeniable evidence, that the HOA had no legal claim to his land. If they wanted a war, he'd fight back with facts. Grabbing his truck keys, he sped off toward the county records office. It was a quiet Saturday morning, and only 2 employees were working. As Ethan approached the counter, an older man with sharp eyes and a knowing smile greeted him. You must be Carter's grandson, he said, adjusting his glasses. Ethan blinked. You knew my grandfather? The man chuckled. Knew him well. He fought off those developers for years. Name's Frank Jenkins. I've been working in records for 3 decades. Frank led Ethan to a small back room filled with old filing cabinets and dusty maps. Let's see what we can find. For 20 tense minutes, Ethan held his breath as Frank flipped through property deeds, easement agreements, and legal documents. Then Frank paused. Ha, he muttered, tapping a faded yellow document. Just as I thought. Ethan leaned in. What is it? Frank slid the paper across the table. There is no easement allowing the HOA to use your land for parking. Not now. Not ever. Relief flooded Ethan's chest. But before he could celebrate, Frank grabbed another document, one that made Ethan's pulse skip a beat. However, Frank continued, adjusting his glasses, this is interesting. He pulled out a property survey from 30 years ago, tracing a finger over an old map. Ethan squinted at the highlighted section. What am I looking at? Frank smiled. See this? This little box here? Ethan nodded. That's the main electrical transformer that powers all of Willow Creek. And guess what? Frank tapped the paper. It's sitting right on your land. Ethan's mind reeled. Wait, are you telling me that I control their electricity? Frank grinned. Legally, yes. That transformer is only allowed to be accessed with your permission. If you wanted to, let's say, restrict access, that'd be well within your rights. Ethan sat back, his anger turning into something far more powerful, a plan. Margaret and her HOA minions thought they held all the power. They thought they could bully him, forge documents, and trample his land. But what they didn't realize was that Ethan literally held the switch to their entire neighborhood. As he grabbed copies of the documents, a slow smile spread across his face. The HOA had pushed him too far. Now, it was time to push back. Ethan drove home with a new sense of purpose. The HOA thought they had him backed into a corner, but they had no idea that their entire community ran on his land's power supply. As soon as he pulled into his driveway, he dialed the emergency line for Pinewood Electric, the power company that managed the transformer on his property. After being transferred twice, a gruff voice finally answered. Ron Fletcher, Operations Manager, what's the issue? This is Ethan Carter. I own the property where transformer E245 is located. Ethan kept his tone calm but firm. I need to report unauthorized access to the unit. A long pause. Then Ron's voice became serious. That's a major safety violation. Who's accessing it? The Willow Creek HOA is claiming rights to my land, Ethan explained. I have legal proof that the transformer is on my property, and I want to restrict access to authorized personnel only. Ron exhaled. That's a big deal, Mr. Carter. If that transformer goes offline, It would cut power to over 200 homes. Ethan smiled. Then maybe the HOA should start respecting property rights. Ron chuckled. I'll email you the maintenance schedule so you know when our guys are out there. And I'll send a notice to our team. Only Pinewood Electric employees are authorized to access the transformer. Ethan thanked him and hung up. His plan was in motion. As he stepped out onto his porch, he spotted movement near his tomato field. His stomach dropped. Margaret was there, directing yet another truck to park dangerously close to his crops. Ethan's anger reignited. He stormed toward her, voice booming, "You're making a big mistake, Margaret." Margaret turned, smirking. "Oh, Mr. Carter, I was just about to drop off some paperwork for you." She handed him a neatly printed document with a smug smile. It was a formal notice from the HOA, stating that Ethan owed a $5,000 fine for unauthorized agricultural activities that violate the aesthetic standards of the community. His own farm, on his own land. Ethan laughed, actually laughed, as he folded the paper and stuffed it into his pocket. "Margaret," he said slowly, "you just made the worst decision of your life." Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. "Excuse me?" Ethan held up a copy of the electrical easement agreement he got from the county records office. "See this?" he said, waving the document. "This is the agreement that proves your entire neighborhood gets its power from a transformer on my land. And guess what? As of today, only Pinewood Electric has access." Margaret's face drained of color. You can't do that," Ethan grinned. "Oh, but I can, and I already have." Margaret's eyes darted around as other HOA members gathered, whispering in confusion. Ethan leaned in. "Now, if I were you, I'd start clearing every single car off my land." Margaret spun on her heel and stormed off, phone already pressed to her ear. Ethan turned back toward his house, watching the HOA members scramble. They weren't in control anymore. He was. Margaret was furious. Ethan could see it in the way she marched toward her car, her phone glued to her ear, no doubt calling every lawyer, politician, and HOA crony she could think of. But Ethan wasn't worried. He had proof that the HOA had no legal claim to his land. And now, he had leverage. As he stepped back onto his porch, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Mr. Carter?" a slick, familiar voice said. "This is Robert Calloway, City Councilman. I heard there's been a misunderstanding with the Willow Creek HOA." Ethan's jaw tightened. "No misunderstanding at all, Mr. Calloway. The HOA is trespassing on my land. That's a crime." Robert chuckled. Now, no need for hostility. I'm sure we can find a solution that benefits both parties." Ethan leaned against his porch railing. "And what would that be?" "A generous buyout," Robert said smoothly. "I have developers willing to purchase your land for a premium. You wouldn't have to deal with any of this HOA nonsense. You could walk away with a big fat check." Ethan's eyes narrowed. So that was their plan all along. Make his life miserable until he sold the farm. "Not interested," Ethan said. Robert sighed. "Look, Ethan, the HOA has powerful friends, judges, city officials. If you fight them, they'll bury you in legal fees. But if you take the deal, you walk away rich and stress-free." Ethan grinned. "Tell you what, Robert, how about you walk away before I call the sheriff and file trespassing charges against the entire HOA?" Silence. Then Robert muttered, "You'll regret this," and hung up. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. They were desperate, and that meant he was winning. The setup. Ethan didn't waste any time. He printed every legal document he had, His deed, the easement agreement, even the fake HOA fines they sent him. Then he called Oliver Jenkins, a well-known attorney specializing in HOA disputes. "Ethan, you've got a solid case," Oliver said. "But I've seen HOAs like this before. They don't play fair." Ethan smirked. "Neither do I." Oliver laughed. "I like you. I'll file a cease and desist order first thing Monday." Ethan hung up and checked the security cameras he'd installed. His stomach dropped. Someone had been near the transformer. He zoomed in. The panel was slightly open and fresh footprints led away from it. His blood ran cold. Someone from the HOA had tried tampering with the power supply. If they were willing to mess with the electricity, what else would they do? This war wasn't over. It was just getting started. Ethan gritted his teeth as he stared at the security footage. Someone from the HOA had tampered with the transformer. They weren't just playing dirty anymore. They were getting dangerous. He immediately called Ron Fletcher from Pinewood Electric. "Ron, I need you to send someone out right now," Ethan said. "Looks like someone messed with the transformer on my property." Ron's voice sharpened. "That's a serious offense, Ethan. If someone without proper clearance was in there, they could have knocked out power for the whole neighborhood. Or worse." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "I've got security footage. You might want to bring the police." Ron didn't hesitate. "I'll be there within the hour." The HOA's power play. Less than 20 minutes later, Margaret's SUV roared up Ethan's driveway, kicking up dust. Behind her, 3 police cruisers, lights flashing. Ethan crossed his arms as Margaret practically skipped out of her car, looking smug. "There he is," she called to the officers. "That man was caught tampering with the transformer." Ethan didn't blink. "That's funny, Margaret, because my security cameras show someone else messing with it. Would you like to see the footage?" Margaret's smirk flickered. "Well, Before she could talk her way out of it, Ron Fletcher pulled up in his company truck, stepping out with a clipboard and a serious expression. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Ron said to the officers. "I just checked our maintenance records. The last authorized service on that transformer was over 3 months ago." One of the officers raised an eyebrow. "So Mr. Carter didn't touch it?" Ron shook his head. "Not unless he's got a Pinewood Electric ID and a work order." He turned to Ethan. "Can I see the footage?" Ethan handed over his phone, playing the security clip. The video clearly showed a man in a dark hoodie opening the transformer panel, messing with the controls, then running off. Ron's face darkened. "That's a federal offense." Margaret's face turned red. I don't know who that is. Probably some vandal." Ron cut her off. "No, Margaret. This was deliberate. If the wrong wires had been pulled, this could have caused an electrical fire. You're lucky this entire neighborhood isn't in a blackout." The lead officer turned to Margaret, his hand hovering near his radio. "Mrs. Hughes, do you have any information on this individual?" Margaret swallowed hard, eyes darting around. "This is ridiculous. He's just trying to make us look bad." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "We'll be investigating this further." Ethan smiled. "You do that." As the cops took statements, Ethan knew he had won another round. But something told him Margaret wasn't done yet. And when people like her got desperate, they got dangerous. Margaret was cornered, and she knew it. The police were asking too many questions, and the evidence against her was piling up fast. But Ethan had learned something about people like her. They never give up without a fight. And sure enough, the very next morning, a certified letter arrived at his mailbox. It was from the HOA. a $5,000 fine. The letter claimed that Ethan was violating community aesthetic standards by engaging in unauthorized agricultural activities on his own farm. At the bottom was Margaret's signature, with a handwritten note. "Perhaps now you'll reconsider our generous parking agreement." Ethan laughed out loud. She still thought she could bully him into submission, but she had no idea what was coming next. The final blow. Ethan grabbed his phone and called Oliver Jenkins, his attorney. "She's trying to fine me for farming," Ethan said, shaking his head. Oliver chuckled. "Classic HOA overreach. Good news? I just filed a cease and desist order against them. And even better, I got us a court hearing." "When?" Ethan asked. Oliver's grin was audible. "Tomorrow morning." Ethan leaned back in his chair, grinning. Perfect. But he wasn't done yet. That evening, he made one last phone call to the local news. "I have a story for you," he said. "It's about an HOA forging documents, abusing power, and illegally trying to seize private property." The reporter on the other end sounded intrigued. "Go on." Ethan smiled. Tomorrow, Margaret Hughes was going to regret ever crossing him. Judgment Day, the next morning, the courtroom was packed. HOA board members sat on one side, whispering nervously. On the other, Ethan, Oliver, and several of his neighbors who had finally had enough. Margaret tried to look calm, but Ethan could see the way she was gripping her pen too tightly, her jaw clenched. Then the judge walked in, and the moment the case began, Margaret's entire empire collapsed. Oliver stood up, his voice strong and clear. "Your Honor, the HOA has been illegally trespassing on my client's land, forging documents, and issuing fraudulent fines. We have photographic evidence, video surveillance, and county records proving that Ethan Carter's property is not part of Willow Creek HOA." He handed a stack of documents to the judge. The judge flipped through them, then looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Hughes, do you have any legal evidence supporting your claim over Mr. Carter's land?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Well, the HOA voted—" The judge cut her off. "That's not how property law works, Mrs. Hughes." Silence. Then the verdict came down. The HOA had no legal claim to Ethan's land. All fines were voided. The HOA was ordered to pay for the damages to Ethan's crops. And most importantly, Margaret Hughes was removed as HOA president. As the judge banged the gavel, Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It was over. Victory and a new beginning. As Ethan walked out of the courthouse, several of his neighbors approached him. "Elena told us everything," one man admitted. "We had no idea how bad it had gotten." A woman sighed. "We're voting in a new HOA board, one that actually respects property rights." Then Thomas, the new HOA president, extended a hand. "We'd like to help repair the damage to your crops," he said. "Maybe we can work together instead of against each other." Ethan hesitated. After everything he'd been through, could he really trust them? Then he looked over his farm, the land his grandfather had worked so hard to protect. He shook Thomas's hand. "I'd like that," Ethan said, "because sometimes good fences make good neighbors." Ethan's battle with the HOA was more than just a fight over land. It was a lesson in standing up for what's right. Too often, HOAs, corporations, and even local governments assume that regular people will back down when faced with legal pressure. They count on homeowners being uninformed, intimidated, or too tired to fight back. But Ethan proved that knowledge is power. By digging into county records, consulting with experts, and gathering undeniable evidence, he turned the tables on a corrupt system. Instead of letting the HOA bully him into submission, he fought back with facts, law, and strategy. This story is a powerful reminder. If you don't defend your rights, someone will take them from you. Whether it's your home, your land, or even your finances, know your rights, document everything, and never let intimidation win. Because when you stand your ground, you might just win the war. If you ever find yourself in a situation like Ethan's, here's what you should do. Checkmark Know Your Property Rights. Always keep a copy of your deed, property survey, and county records proving ownership. Document everything. Take photos, videos, and written records of any HOA violations or damages. Check HOA rules carefully. If you're part of an HOA, read your contract line by line to know what they can and cannot enforce. Consult a lawyer. HOA disputes can turn ugly fast. A good real estate attorney can shut them down before they escalate. Use the power of publicity. If your HOA is acting corrupt, involve local news, social media, or even legal authorities. Most importantly, never assume the HOA is always right. Question everything. Because sometimes the people in charge are the ones breaking the rules.